It's all good.
We started recording right now and the room is open, so let's welcome our participants who are just entering our room. Welcome to the webinar.
Welcome to our first webinar.
Oh, okay, so it's the numbers going up. There are 12 people registered online.
Where do you see that, Jane?
If you take your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see participants.
Okay, perfect. Got it.
And I will keep, I guess we'll all keep tabs on the chat box. Are you planning to stop at any point, Graham, so we can deal with questions?
Oh yeah, happy to, of course.
Okay.
So maybe it will be interesting to say that we are just waiting a little bit for the exact time to begin. So for the participants who have already entered the room, welcome. And to just to say that we are just making a little bit more time for others who will join us in a few minutes, and we will start in a couple of minutes. In my watch, 2 minutes.
Yeah, 2 on mine too.
Uh-oh. We have another participant.
Welcome.
Yes,
He's not muted.
Hello to everyone. I can see some familiar names here to me, some friends. Hello, hello to everyone, and very good wishes of a new year to everyone. Thank you for coming. One more minute, just to British punctuality. Hello, Sonia. Sonia's writing. Thank you. And Happy New Year to everyone. And Sonia Noronha saying, but everyone can know about that. And Jane has also written and welcoming everyone in the written form. So I think we could begin. It's now time, exact time, 2 p.m., please. Me, please.
Sure. So welcome everybody. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm part of the CPD organizing committee at Amy, and on behalf of myself, Helena, Felipe, and Jane Tipping, we welcome you to the first CPD webinar. It's a great initiative for us, and we're really excited. So the work in CPD has always been welcomed within Amy, but it's only been within the last 2 years that we've started to really gain ground and momentum and to become more visible and significant within the organization. So we have a CPD committee and a special interest group that were both established in 2017, and we've created some very important initiatives. So the webinar is one of these. And some of the other initiatives that we've done, which you'll see is a CPD edition of MedEd Teacher and MedEd Publish as well, 2 CPD symposia within the annual conference, and a special track within the annual meeting. So just some Oh, I'm having a bit of a tech issue here. Let me just see if I can do this quickly. Sorry, everybody. There we go. So as I mentioned, the CPD organizing committee for the webinars is Helena, Jane, and myself. For those of you who are interested in seeing the upcoming CPD webinars, you can look at the web address that we've put up on the slide at the moment. I checked that today, and that has everything for the rest of the year. And for those of you who are interested, our next webinar will take place on Monday the 4th of February at the same time, in the same time slot with Jocelyn Lockyer, and looks at physician assessment. So just some instructions and some logistics on our side to help.
Amy, we're not seeing your slides.
Oh, sorry, Jane.
Yeah.
What am I doing here? Hold on. Let me see. Is that better? Can we see that, Jane?
Yes, I can see it now.
Okay, perfect. Oh, so let's just put it back there. So that's the upcoming CPD webinars. You can find all the CPD webinars for the rest of the year, and also that our next webinar will take place in the same time slot on Monday the 4th of February with Jocelyn, and it will look at physician assessment. Just from a logistics perspective, some of us are new to using Zoom. Some of us obviously new to the AMY webinar program. So we're looking at running this webinar for about 60 minutes today with 15 minutes of questions. Obviously, if we have questions we'll stop and we'll address those. It will be recorded for those of you who are unable to stay for the duration, and will also be available on the website. You just need to find out about that. From a participation interaction perspective, unfortunately at this point we don't have capacity for verbal comments or questions, but there is a chat box that you can type in, and as the organizers we will continue to look through it and address the relevant questions. Graham's also very happy to cover any questions that come up during the session. And then from a technical perspective, we are unable to provide any direct technical support through the system, but normally the best way to kind of deal with things is just to log out and log in again on your same link. And that normally tends to sort out issues. So hopefully it's been an easy link for you, and I'm going to hand over to Jane to do the welcome for Graham.
All right, thank you, Amy. So it's, just to let you know, I am Jane Tipping. And it's my pleasure to introduce Graham today as our inaugural speaker. As many of you probably already know and are quite familiar with Graham's presence within CME, but he is the president and CEO of the Accreditation Council for CME, as well as being an adjunct professor at Northwestern University. Within this role, then, he directs the ACCME systems for accrediting national and international CPD providers, and also co-directs the joint accreditation for international professional continuing education. So we have a wealth of knowledge and expertise here with Graham. As Amy mentioned, we can't handle verbal questions, but please do use your chat box, and we'll do our best to keep in touch with that and keep feeding your questions to Graham as we go along. But I thought before we started, it might be nice, Graham, to have more of a personal sense of who you are in terms of your involvement with CME. And so, as I mentioned to you, I thought it would be, I'm curious myself in terms of what attracted you to the field of CPD, because not everybody goes in that direction. And then the second question being, what would you like to be remembered for in terms of your role?
Well, thank you, Jane, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody from here in Chicago. It's a pleasure to have a chance to chat with you all. Thanks for those questions, Jane. What drew me into CPD was really my passion and joy for teaching and learning. Those became apparent when I was a medical student, when I started becoming a critic of the tests that I was taking, and an observer of teachers, and really interested and finding great satisfaction in seeing my colleagues and my peers and junior peers learn under my tutelage. So that drew me into education. And then I became a course director at Harvard and did my doctoral degree in education, and started really thinking about educational experimentation and enjoying that part of it. But I think what drew me into CPD was the fact that it was so much more difficult in my experience than the standard curricula and the standard approaches and the homogeneity of medical students and in many cases residents, and the great difficulty in engaging very diverse audiences and helping them unlearn. So I'm always up for a challenge, and that seemed like one to take on.
Right.
In terms of what I'd like to be remembered for, I think trying to infuse a sense of both joy and fun in learning for our professional colleagues. I think if we can return to those premises of saying this should be enjoyable, it should be fun, it should be sustaining, it should be, it's not about compliance, it's about getting the most out of yourself and driving terrific intellectual curiosity and satisfaction for our learner community.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's quite inspiring. One of the things that Dave Davis says often, and I totally agree with, is the whole concept of, in a way, CME, CPD is sort of the Wild West of medical education. There's lots of room for creativity and innovation.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. So we will hand it over to you now, Graham, and
great.
See where we go.
Super. So, so I've got a couple of slides to take us through some of my observations about where continuing education, CPD, CME, however you term it, is evolving. And there's so many changes and so much happening that it's just really fun to talk about and think about some of these issues. From my perspective, I'm actually going to maybe put up a couple of the first polling questions, Helena, and go through each of the 4 first polling questions just to get a sense for the audience who's with us and what some of the initial questions are, because that'll help me think about how we evolve. Are you able to put up the first question? Is that Helena or?
I am trying to.
Awesome.
Okay. So participants can now, please, our invitees can now express your experience using the poll. Can you see the results on your screen, Graham?
I cannot, no.
Okay, so I will close now, and I will share the results now.
Oh, cool.
Now you can see those. Okay.
Great. So interestingly, we have a diversity of people on the line, not many from primary and community health, at least in the responders, but great to see a diversity of those from schools and societies, as well as academic healthcare. Thank you, Helene. Okay. Here's the next question. We're going to come back to these at the end of the session to see if there's been any shift in thinking here. But I think this is a pretty provocative question. Do you think that in general, clinicians can reliably maintain their own professional competencies?
Okay, let's go for the second one.
Yeah, you can pop that up and we'll do the next 2 as well after this.
Should be on the screen right now.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I can see it.
Okay. Couple of seconds more. And I will share now the results. Okay, should be on your screens right now.
Not just yet, Helena.
Okay.
Here we are. So mostly,
Okay.
mostly askew to the disagree side here. About 50–60% feeling like clinicians cannot reliably retain their own professional, maintain their own professional competencies. About 20% agree that they probably can, and about a quarter not so sure. Last two questions, and then we'll move on to some of my thoughts. What do you think about this one? Health system employers are increasingly engaged in the performance management of their professional staff.
Let me just. For some reason, there's some difficult. Okay. Let's go for third. And launch. And you should be having it. Okay. Thank you for participating. Okay, this is, it's unanimous. I will share the results right now.
Well, mine disappeared very quickly.
So
Hello.
don't mind, I didn't get a chance to vote.
I think it might have just got one vote. All right, well, we can come back to some of these at the end. Maybe we'll go on to the last one and we'll come back to some of these. But
Okay.
how about this one? The CME or CPD community is evolving to meet the changing learning needs of physicians.
So this will be the fourth. This is not working as fast as we would like to. We have to, so it should be right now, it's running. So I'll wait. Yeah, much more participative right now. Let's wait a couple of seconds more. People is still choosing. Okay. Anyone else would like to vote? This is anonymous, by the way. So, okay, I will close it. And I will share the results.
Great, so a skew towards the agree, many people feeling like we are evolving, or at least those who are represented on the webinar here feel like we are evolving together to meet those changing needs. Okay, so thanks for those, Helena, and for managing those poll questions. A couple of things are really abundantly clear and probably would result in no argument from anyone on the webinar, that the environment for clinicians, broadly speaking, whether those are nurses or doctors or other healthcare professionals, have evolved very quickly and substantially. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Singapore or Johannesburg or Amsterdam or Chicago, we're seeing the same pattern all across the world in terms of how healthcare professionals are being pressurized to work in incredibly more complicated and more difficult environments. Certainly, I still see patients here in Chicago in endocrinology. I'm an endocrinologist, and I see enormous amounts of administrative burden around me. Chart requirements and billing and coding have become administratively laborious. I'm expected to have productivity. The difficulty of the work is unlike anything that I experienced during my training. The patients are incredibly complex. There was a recent paper looking at the complexity of care in the United States by internal medicine and its subspecialties, finding that the average number of comorbidities for patients being seen by internal medicine had grown substantially. The median number of medicines in patients being seen by internal medicine subspecialists had risen to 13, the median. So this is patients are a median taking 13 different medicines in internal medicine. And the same is true for surgical and other subspecialties, that the difficulty of the work and the complexities of the patients, as we've achieved greater abilities to care for patients, and longevity has improved. The complexity of care has also improved. The patients have greater expectations of their clinicians. It's not just that they are able to make wise decisions, but that they are also able to communicate those, manage themselves, manage their teams, manage their practices and their businesses. And then the clinicians are feeling really strung by the balance of home expectations and working expectations, because unlike times of yore, where in many cases the clinician was supported by an at-home parent or otherwise, now you have families where dual working parents, and balancing that in the complexity of care and the environment is really hard. And this is really relevant to us as educators, because unless we frame our work in the context of how our clinicians are trying to get their work done and the environment in which they are doing work, we are going to struggle to maintain relevance and impact. I think the other thing that's really relevant is that the shift to a broader range of competencies, expectations for individual clinicians has been a challenge for us. We used to focus almost entirely over onto the far left of this series of columns as we think about developing and maintaining our professional competency. But it's now abundantly clear that if you are expected to be in a patient-facing specialty or practice area and you can't communicate, or you can't work collectively with a team member in a professional manner, or you can't keep up with your notes and your documentation in terms of being system and practice aware and be able to be professionally competent in understanding your own strengths and the system's ability to work around you, you will not be an effective clinician. And it doesn't matter whether you're a pathologist or an anesthesia nurse. These expectations are broad and very diverse. And much of our educational programs have focused on the far left and continue to focus on the far left here because of the difficulty of educating and assessing those things that are not patient care and medical knowledge related. But one of the things that's often unclear to many clinicians, or a blind spot for them in my experience, is that their individual abilities across these competencies are very variable. There's no such thing as a physician who's perfect across the board. No matter how many of them think they're perfect across the board, the fact remains that you would be an unusual human being if you had perfection across every domain of competency. So our role as educators is helping clinicians to maximize their ability in each of these areas across the domains of professional competency. It's also worth acknowledging that even within one of these pillars, like medical knowledge or patient care, I as an endocrinologist may practice mostly diabetes care, but I'd be expected to know enough about thyroids and pituitaries and adrenals. And the same with thoracic surgeons. They should know general principles of infection control and disease management and cancer care as relevant to them. So the domains of competencies across each of these is vast. Within each of these is also subdivided into, literally for each of us as practicing clinicians, literally hundreds of competencies of which we are expected to be reliably competent, but that has simply become humanly impossible to be reliably competent across every single competency that's expected of us. And the questions that we have as educators that try and support our physician and our clinician colleagues is helping them recognize where they have strengths, where they have areas for growth, and then supporting them in those areas. One of the key issues related to that competency issue is poor self-awareness. Now, this is just a typical graphic from, in fact, residents, not even physicians. But this graphic and the findings in it have been replicated in so many other areas, including in professional physicians. And what this graphic shows is when you actually assess clinicians, you see across the blue line here, the range of competencies that are found, whether they're residents or students or practicing physicians. there is a range of competencies. In this case, this was in OB-GYN. But then you ask clinicians before they see the result how they think they did. And what's important here is that there is generally a mismatch between perception and actual ability. And when there's a mismatch between perception and actual ability, that creates real problems. Because if you don't have competence that's matched by confidence, then you create errors. And this is a real challenge for us as educators because it's not comfortable or popular to pierce self-confidence with self-awareness. But it is so important. If clinicians don't realize that they have a confidence gap, they won't fix it. And if they have self-perceptions of confidence where there isn't competence, they will make errors. And we know those are all around us. We see errors happening all around us all the time. It's also interesting on the far right of this curve is that clinicians who have the highest levels of ability tend to underestimate their actual ability. And this may be true in some areas versus others, but it causes problems in that clinicians who are underconfident for their actual ability tend to make too many tests, tend to delay, and don't tend to make accurate, efficient findings. So there are problems at every part of this, but we've accultured clinicians to be overconfident, and that results in problems and errors in performance. So these are some summaries that I think are worthwhile just reflecting on for us as educators because they help us anticipate the future of professional development. Many people, including our clinician colleagues, are complacent about and have difficulty identifying their own areas of growth. They presume that they are capable across the dimensions that they would be tested on or that they feel are socially desirable for their profession. It's nearly impossible to surmise what you do not know. If you think there's only 3 medicines to treat a condition when there's actually 6, and you use those 3 medicines in a way that you think is appropriate, and I ask you, how do you think you do treating that disease, and you think there's only 3 medicines, you're going to think you do a great job. If you are not aware that there's another 3 medicines that you could be using, you couldn't possibly be aware that you're not doing a good job. We are generally poor assessors of the extent of our own deficits because we are psychologically self-protective. And we are faced with the challenge that our practice types and the learning needs are extremely diverse. It's not like medical school or residencies where there's standard curricula and expectations. The expectations for a specialist in diabetes and community practice in an urban environment are so specific and so unique that it's impossible to generate reliable curricula for those types of individual clinicians. It's also worth acknowledging that it's challenging to engage cognitively, to learn effectively when you're tired, stressed, distracted, or burned out. And does anyone know any clinicians who happen to be tired, stressed, distracted, or burned out? They're everywhere. They're all of us. These rates are really high. So there's a lot of challenges that we have as educators to drive performance to a really high level. But it's not just these challenges that we face. We know that there are major system issues. There are problems with patient safety that are well known. Every time you peel back that curtain, every time you measure something, you see opportunities for improvement. There are gross disparities in access and quality all across the globe. And there's a great deal of inefficient and very high cost care happening around the globe, largely in some cases because clinicians are not being managed and their performance is not being managed and they're not getting feedback about their management because feedback is not readily available. Organizationally, whether you're a medical society or a medical school or you're a hospital or a health system, there are real challenges to implement major change. There's reliance on staid models or old models of learning that we know to be ineffective, but are popular. If you put a clinician in a dark room and there's a speaker on the stage, it's very easy for that clinician to believe that she must be learning because somebody is speaking. I must be learning, right? I'm in an educational environment. Somebody's speaking. I'm here. I've dedicated my time. I'm here. I must be learning, right? And all of us on this webinar know that that's probably more untrue than it is true. In many cases, she's not learning. And it's worse that she's believing that she's learning when she's not. So staid models of education, passive learning approaches just are real challenges to usurp, because engaging that woman, that clinician, in higher levels of cognitive engagement is more difficult for her and is more demanding for her. And she may reject it if you ask her to do more participatory exercises, and she may believe that she's learning in that environment. Evolving to longitudinal engaged technologies, etc., can be costly. Many physician leadership don't think of this as their responsibility, professional management. There are obviously resource limitations. Anyone? Anyone? Resource limitations? No? Everyone has resource limitations. Retraining staff is time consuming and takes them away from the productivity demands that are present in their environments. And then our learners are also challenged. They're overburdened, they're burned out, they sometimes lack the joy of learning. They have poor self-awareness, they're relatively complacent. They often consume continuing education for compliance rather than any other reason. And that creates a credit-seeking behavior versus a learning-seeking behavior. And if you come to a session with the intent of getting, let's say, 2 credits in patient safety, because that's required for you, what do you think the chances of you actually learning anything are? There's just about 0, because your mind is not on the learning. Your mind is on the credit. And you'll sit there and you'll endure it because you have to, and you're a very obedient clinician. But there's no way you're really going to engage in learning because your mind just isn't there. That's not your purpose. So we have real challenges across our system as we try and think about redesigning it to change how we do this work and how we help our colleagues perform at their very best. So just to duplicate some of the things we've been, and to reinforce some of the things we've been talking about, we certainly have an ideal audience to work with. They have high attainment and capacity, whether you're healthcare professionals or physicians. They're motivated for mastery. There's many competing pressures on them. Self-awareness is often poor. Competency is unfortunately assumed. It's hard to learn by observation, especially hard to unlearn. It's a real challenge for us as CPD educators that we have to get clinicians to stop doing things a certain way and help them do them in a new way. And that's cognitively very difficult. It makes us very different from our educators in UME and GME because helping people unlearn is much more challenging. Clinicians need a lot of feedback to do that process, and that's more laborious for the educators. Our clinician community all learn differently, although they do tend to learn better together. Context relevance tends to be important. And we have an uphill battle because many view CME, CPD as compliance rather than professional development. And a good deal of it is passive and reinforces that complacency that is our enemy. Fortunately, there's lots of good news too. I mean, we have a lot of challenges, but we also have a lot of good news. It's definitely been demonstrated that education and learning can be very positive experiences for people. And the learning can be incredibly effective. Just on a personal level, learning can be used as a convening power to bring people together. And just that by itself has power and merit. Even if no learning happens, just bringing people together to learn to talk to each other, trust each other, share coffee, whatever it is, can be really helpful. Intellectual fulfillment helps to mitigate burnout because it keeps us bright and engaged. The opportunity to bring people together and help teams form and norm tend to be very important to help those teams function. And increasingly, as you all know, we're working in a team-based environment. And seeing QI and education emerge and being able to see the results of change in a practice, for example, if you see your operative success rates improve because you're tracking it over time and you're learning how to improve your operative success rates, that is very fulfilling to any clinician who's motivated for mastery. So these things can come together and make for much more satisfied and happy clinicians. On the other side, of course, education can be transformative for the system, not just for the individual, but it can create engagement of people with the system's priorities. It can drive relationships that are important for a culture of trust and engagement. It can create the self-awareness that creates and nurtures humility. It can create ultimately the improvement and the change and the better health that all of us who are passionate educators really believe in, because education can be transformative. You've all, I suspect, been in programs where you've seen the spark appear in your learner when they suddenly realize a new skill, they suddenly realize a new capacity that they had, that a new piece of information is going to help them do better for patients that they've cared for. I've enjoyed that process. I've learned through my own learning experiences and CME activities to change and improve. And those are all very satisfying, ultimately fulfilling. And I think we lose sometimes some of this. As I mentioned at the top of the call, one of the things that I hope will be any legacy that I ever leave will be trying to reinstill a joy of learning amongst our professional colleagues. And that's because not only does it help that, but you achieve system performance improvements in doing so. I also realize that a lot of my conversations now are with health system leaders, trying to help them engage in transformation at the hospital or health system level and engage their professionals in competency management. And what they're realizing is that education delivers a return on investment. And that's a really valuable observation if you can get health system leaders to realize it, because then they will invest in their educators and they will invest in their educational infrastructure and they will invest in the time needed to achieve these types of engaged outcomes. So if education works, it can deliver higher quality of care. I don't know how many manuscripts we've shown over the last several years that show that is demonstrably true. Project after project after project shows that when you invest in teaching and learning, it makes a difference to the outcomes that patients assume. Not every time, but in many cases. Reduced cost and utilization are those benefits that are useful for an employer, and they may never realize that education is an important vehicle through which they can achieve that. Worker satisfaction sounds like we're building factories, but if you think of this as a performance management for professionals, and you can improve satisfaction, reduce burnout, improve engagement with the organization, then you really realize what you have. Same is true for productivity, and importantly for reduced turnover. The costs of recruitment for a new clinician in the United States is probably for a single physician now exceeds about $50,000 to $60,000 just for one new hire. And those are extraordinarily high costs. And if you can reduce turnover, you can save a lot of money and spend that on educational infrastructure and support, and it can make a big difference for the system's performance as well. So what does that all mean then? How do we put this together into a future model for where CME and CPD is going? Well, there's a couple of things we're going to have to talk through. We're going to have to talk through an evolution in delivery models. We'll have to talk through an evolution in the actual educational approach. And we're going to have to talk through some of the implications for what it means for individual physicians or clinicians and their engagement in their own learning. So that kind of a cultural transformation. But one of the key things that seems apparent, at least here in the US, and I have to imagine this is happening across the world as well, is that there's an increasing recognition of the role of local and team-based learning. And that while national specialty and big organizations and big conferences are incredibly important and appear to be growing here in the US, at least in terms of attendance and engagement. They also need to live alongside the importance of consolidating that learning that happens at a national specialty meeting with more local longitudinal learning that happens on the ground with the team. So certainly learning things like standards of care, best practices, large groups in a specialty area. If there's only 3 endocrinologists like me at a health system, which wouldn't be unusual, then we're going to have a difficult time learning just from each other. We'll need to turn to our national specialty society or international specialty society to help us learn best practices in endocrinology. But then we need to learn how to apply that to our environment and work with our teams. And that's where you need local educational programming. So local issues, dealing with local quality issues and local obstacles, how we teach each other in our practice and learn to rely on each other, how we build and nurture our team. There tend to be small group activities. And of course, there's a synergy between these two. You can imagine the National Specialty Society putting out tabletop exercises that the 3 endocrinologists in the small health system can sit with and work through together and build a shared view about how to manage these complicated and context-relevant cases. But there's an important alignment that we need to stand up local and team-based learning as much as we need to reinforce and consolidate and strengthen national and specialty level large group programming. So next thing I want to do is show you a brief video. Hopefully this will play okay for us. And just, it's just about 45 seconds, but I just want you to observe this little kid who's in a Montessori environment. Those of you who are in Montessori will recognize this as the classical pink tower. My kids have been in Montessori education, but just observe a few things about what's going on here. So it may seem silly to show you how a kid learns and what a kid is learning in the context of professional development, particularly amongst highly sophisticated learners like our healthcare community. But when you think about educational design, I find it fascinating to look at how children learn and how we instruct them and how we help them learn in environments like this. If you think about what this little boy seems to be learning, he is learning a whole series of skills using a whole series of different approaches. It required no teacher intervention, and the kid received a ton of feedback and support, not just from his peers, but from the actual tool itself. So if you think of what he's learning here, he's learning everything from center of gravity, hierarchy, order. He's learning pincer movement, the physical act of choosing from an array of objects. He's self-managing his own time and energy, but he's also getting immediate feedback anytime he gets something wrong. So you saw that he could see things were out of order as he placed them, and he was able to correct himself through that process, even when it required reconstructing from the get-go to try and get it right. You also saw him helped and supported by a classmate who was able to point out an error at the very end. So there's a whole series of things in here in terms of an instructional design approach that are elegant, efficient, and effective. And there are lessons here for the ways in which we think about the learning experiences we put in front of our healthcare community as well. Because if we don't pay attention to some of these issues, we will lose our learners. So just like this little kid was engaged at the start because it was an intrinsically attractive tool, it's pink, it's squares, it's light, it's easy to move around, maybe he's seen some other kids play with it, it creates and stimulates some curiosity. And it's the way in which we think we tend to focus as we develop educational program, we focus on the learning, right there, the third step. And we don't think about how are we going to create curiosity, how are we going to create engagement, and then ultimately how we're going to create change. So how do you create curiosity? The first is, well, certainly don't say this is a 2-credit program and it'll fulfill your governmental requirements in whatever it is, because that doesn't create curiosity. You create curiosity by helping people realize that it's something that they don't know. Maybe you provoke them, maybe you inspire them, maybe you stimulate them with something that makes them think that it's going to help them in their practice. And sometimes it's mentored. It means somebody's saying to you, you should go to this program because you need this skill. Or maybe it's even a national society saying, people with this specialty need this particular skill. You should be curious about it because it's really interesting and fascinating. But then if we have them curious, we've got to get them. And we've got to get them engaged. And if you don't get them engaged in literally the first few minutes of an exercise or an activity, you will lose them to their phones, as you well know. And what loses engagement? If something seems irrelevant to them, these very busy clinicians won't pay any more attention. They'll move on very quickly. Some might say that is a problem for us as a community because not everything is immediately relevant. You need to be able to spot the zebras or the very unusual phenomena in medical education. But we got to work with engagement. So how do you get people engaged? Well, you demonstrate to them pretty early that it's going to be an efficient experience for them, that the content can be trusted, that it's meaningful for them and their patients, and that it's relevant for their practice. And every time you're talking to an educational designer or one of your colleagues who's putting together a program, ask yourself these questions. How are we going to create curiosity about this activity or this program? How are we going to create engagement and maintain it? Of course, most of us are pretty good at creating strong learning experiences once we have their attention and we have them engaged. But one of the things that we don't do particularly well is create activities that are allow for practice, allow for personalization, and that provide plenty of feedback. Those are laborious from an educator's perspective to create activities that have that type of opportunity. Technology can sometimes help, but fundamentally it's just more difficult to create activities that allow clinicians to derive that sort of feedback from it so that they can learn and practice repeatedly through this deliberate process of learning. The other thing we as educators are pretty poor at in general is creating longitudinal relationships that support change. And until we think of ourselves as being as responsible for that as we are for the strong learning experience, we will not be achieving our important outcomes. So it's got to be supported, measured, rewarded, create opportunities for reflection, and then repeat over time. And if you do those things, you'll actually evolve your program successfully and make the change that we're all looking for. But this also has implications, not just in educational design in terms of how we help clinicians do the things they need to do to develop insights on their own personal strengths, areas for growth, making personal learning plans, participating actively, avoid assuming that they're learning. But we have to make the quality programs to dovetail with that. But we do have to help clinicians do the things they need to do themselves. And that's a bit of a culture change. It's not fair really to ask the entire CME community to fix the culture of learning amongst the entire medical community. But we got to work somehow to try and resolve this issue because clinicians need to take responsibility for this. We can take responsibility for mandates and other draconian approaches to try and drive learning because it just isn't going to work. So we have to work with our professional colleagues in the regulatory environment and licensing and credentialing and other things to help clinicians do these things voluntarily and embrace learning rather than through mandates. So a couple of things that are worth thinking about performance management for physicians from my experience. One of the first things is, as a CME or a CPD provider, just developing an annual education strategy for yourself. What are you going to focus on? How are you going to evolve your program? How are you going to develop curiosity, engagement, learning, and change? Redesigning your live learning approaches so that they're participatory and active, and avoid consolidating passive approaches. Redesigning online learning so that it's not streaming PowerPoint presentations, but they're participatory and engaged and active. Use educational technology. Facilitate post-activity workplace learning so that it's impactful in the environment. Grow team-based learning approaches and use social learning, closed Facebook groups for problem solving in your discipline, whatever it is that helps clinicians grow and that is relevant and meaningful for them, particularly in the micro moments between patients or while they're waiting in a grocery line. Similarly, engaging with our colleagues in QI learning so that the learnings are consolidated and engaged in quality improvement, very important. Internally in a CME unit, you need internal leadership though. You've got to see competency management as an organizational responsibility as a CME unit and in your organization. That's a cultural shift. It's a cultural shift to valuing learning and people over process. It's not about the credit. It's not about the process. It's about helping people grow and achieve their maximum practice at the top of their capacity. It's about facilitating creativity, professional development of the CPD team itself, and then ultimately we're developing competencies in data management over the longer term so that we can track and support individual clinicians over time. Last 2 or 3 things I'll just mention are what we're seeing in terms of team-based learning and interprofessional education. We here in the US have been developing standards for education that are cross-disciplinary and cross-professional so that we can encourage and support interprofessional education because it works. If the more the teams learn together, the more they practice well together. And that's been demonstrated repeatedly, including by this study by the late Scott Reeves. But it's worth emphasizing as educators that we should avoid trying to silo ourselves into just being physician educators. We should be talking to our colleagues in nurse education, pharmacy education, social work, wherever, to try and create shared experiences across the professions. Here in the US, we have now shared accreditation standards for postgraduate education between nursing, pharmacy, medicine, social work, physician assistants, optometry, with several additional ones actually coming soon, which is really exciting, all coming under this one umbrella of joint accreditation. So we've shared interprofessional CE standards that we all duplicate and agree to manage, and one accreditation process for organizations that want to do interprofessional education so that they don't have to hold multiple accreditations to do strong postgraduate education that engages the team. But a key to this process, though, is you. Not surprisingly, CME professionals are so unusual and so unique and so special that you have educational expertise, you know quality and safety priorities, you know public health, you know the local gaps and needs, you know how to work with interprofessional teams, you know what the issues are about engaging with your learner community, and you know the balance with licensure, certification, credentialing, and regulations. The CME professionals bring that together in unique ways and make themselves invaluable to their organizations, even if their organization doesn't realize how invaluable they are. CME professionals are exactly there, trying to be at the nexus of driving performance and change. And the one thing I would try and be thoughtful and cautious about is not having CME professionals being these compliance specialists, because it causes all sorts of problems when we represent ourselves as such or follow along with just being the credit, rubber stamping applications for credit or something like that. who remembers their last compliance education, whether it's fire safety or something else? It just doesn't really work because people aren't there voluntarily. They're not there with a thirst for knowledge or a joy for learning, and they don't tend to remember what they actually learned. So building the value of CME and changing for the future is going to be a long process, but it's going to be worth it. We have a lot of work to do with the C-suite of our employers, leaders in quality and safety, and educational leaders. We have responsibilities as an accreditor to ensure that all of the providers we accredit have flexibility so that their credits are recognized by all of the variety of regulators here in the US, and we've had great experience and success doing that, and that the output of the educational programs is recognized. That may seem like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth about saying it's not about the credit and it's not about compliance. But if you take care of the back end regulatory requirements and data tracking issues and make them easy and straightforward, our thesis and our evidence has been that then that becomes secondary and people don't worry so much about that because they can focus now on the learning. And so we take care of the back end data management, data tracking, reporting of individual credits between providers and organizations who need that information. And then we let the educators focus on teaching and learning and let the learners focus on learning. Several things we could talk about that help us evolve. We've talked about some of these issues, but within organizations starting to develop a learning mindset, appointing chief learning officers, valuing and reimbursing educators, creating time to convene. I know how difficult these things are. They all sound like pie in the sky, but there are organizations who've done this and done it successfully and seen the fruits of their change. Using technology, creating collaborations, particularly across professions within your organization, and then getting information from your learners so that you're developing an annual educational strategy, all reasonably straightforward things that organizations can do to help them evolve and be effective successfully. So how is CME evolving and what's the CME for the future? Well, it's got to be those things we've been talking about. You've got to recognize where your clinicians are coming from. Remember that very first slide where we looked at the very difficult work that clinicians are engaged in these days and the many pressures that are on them. And the challenges that we have in then engaging them and overcoming their sense of confidence without making them more depressed and burned out and giving them back some joy of learning. It means we really have to evolve to creating meaningful and relevant, active, participatory experiences that give lots of feedback, more local opportunities, easy search and retrieval to maximize relevance, interprofessional so the team is engaged, accounts for a variety of regulatory expectations so that people don't have to think about that and it's tracked automatically for them, and hopefully delivers personalized recommendations and increasingly supported by the employer or the reimburser of some sort, so there's time available to engage in these types of activities and grow professionally. So physician and healthcare education is challenging. We have lots of issues facing us. There's a lot of ways we are very different from medical school educators and residency educators. We have unique issues that we have to solve and unique challenges in doing so. The traditional view of CME and CPD does need to evolve, but fortunately it is changing reasonably quickly. We're seeing lots of new formats and approaches, diverse array of relevant practical programs, about 160,000 different activities created every year here in the US, at least in our system. Increased focus on leadership communication and a broad range of competencies. And just remembering that, that ACCME is here to help. So Helena, maybe I'll turn it back to you, and I don't know if we can run the last three of those polls again, just to see where the audiences are, if we've dented that. And while you're doing those polls, if you on the line have questions, comments, or thoughts that you want to share, use that chat box that's on your screen so that we can deal with some of those. And between the panelists here, we can address some of them. So let's have a look at maybe some of those questions, Helene, as as we look again. You able to pop those up?
I seem to have lost my, sorry. I seem to have lost my screen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know what happened here. Maybe if, I think either Amy or Jen can try and do it from their own side. Could you try it? You will see in the toolbars that is below, you will see enquete, the word enquete, and you could try that. I don't know what happened here. Let me just...
What's the word again, Helena?
It's enquete. It sounds like a French word.
I don't have that.
Have those? Because I either can see either the slides, either the last slide, or the video.
Not to worry, Helena.
We do have a few questions in the chat box, Graham.
Yes.
I know I didn't answer, to give you the comparison of the poll. But at least we can keep the conversation going while we're seeing if we can get the poll going.
Well, Jane, did you see any along there that you wanted me to?
Well, we have three. There is one, let's see, on what's your opinion on e-learning and CME? Can it really be the way to go?
Well, I think e-learning is definitely the way to go in some respects, but it can't be the only way to go. Because there are so many advantages to coming together with our peers and talking and having somebody share a problem with us and develop those relationships. We learn through those very powerfully. So e-learning can be very efficient, it can be very effective, but it can't be the only mechanism by which clinicians engage in their own professional development or in which they're or by which they're held accountable. But e-learning can also be miserable and dreadful. So it's a matter of how you do your work in e-learning, and all e-learning is not the same. I would say that a key element to making e-learning work is the time for consolidation and rehearsal and reinforcement. That e-learning has the opportunity to engage clinicians repeatedly over time, and that by itself has great power because memory works by when it's reminded and rehearsed and creates opportunities for repetition. So as long as you have those opportunities and are facilitating technology to do that, then that's great.
Right.
The other thing briefly, Jane, that e-learning is able to do is adapt the educational deliverable based on assessed competencies or assessments that are going along the way. If somebody's answering all the level 1 questions the first time with high confidence, then just get them onto level 2, much more efficient for them. They don't have to go through all of the level 1 items. So technology can be very efficient from that perspective and make it a much more relevant experience. If you keep asking me level 1 questions about diabetes, I might get bored and irritated pretty quickly. While if I see myself quickly evolving to levels 3, 4, and 5 because the system's recognizing my capacity, then that can be very effective. So e-learning can be terrific, has to be carefully designed, and the most important elements are using time-variant time to reinforce and repeat and consolidate, and number 2, to increasingly personalize to make it an efficient experience.
Right. Thank you. And I guess it's it fits into it's another tool. It's not the answer. It's another tool that's available to us. It certainly helps increase accessibility for many people. I'm hoping, Sonia, that Graham's response also answered for you what makes good e-learning. I mean, I read into that response that we had both downside and the upside. But if there's more you want to know, please put it in the chat box. I was wondering myself, out of curiosity, I'm intrigued by the idea of a chief learning officer. And I'm wondering, Graham, what would you say that person's responsibility would be then? In
Yeah,
an
it's
organization?
because we've had a growth in chief learning officers, not just in corporate environments, but also in academic ones. And in some respects, the academic chief learning officers that are developing and flourishing, it seems, are learning a lot from chief learning officers in corporations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look at how McDonald's or Ford or any of the big organizations that in some cases are not nearly the size of some of the major academic health systems are thinking about professional management of the competencies of the staff, they spend a fortune on it, and they take it very seriously, and they're actively engaged in that process. The same is true for some academic chief learning officers. Essentially what they've done is they look at the educational infrastructure that's available for the organization. That means where are the conference rooms? Where's the sim center if there is one? How are people learning in the operating theater? How are we driving to improve patient safety as an organization? How are we using data to inform individual competency determinations? How are we helping those clinicians to grow? How do we reimburse mentors for time to spend with their colleagues, supporting their excellence in care? How do we create an observation program to help each other grow? How do we create an environment of trust?
Right, that's a big job.
Those are things that it's not just about managing a learning management system online and managing the conferencing scheduling system. It's about thinking about institutional capacity and growth.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
Graham, one of the other questions that was raised by Frederico was how do we control the quality of e-learning, which I think is something that it's something that we're looking into in our unit. But how do you control what the person's actually getting out? And yes, an assessment's great, but how do you then check that they know what they think that they know?
Yeah, this is not easy. Otherwise, we'd be doing it all the time because assessment has to be linked to the outcome, the desired outcome. And in many cases, the desired outcomes in CPD are so variant that it's hard to be prescriptive about what the assessment should look like. So it's not easy. In our case, as an accreditor, we tend to rely on the professionalism of the CME community to be able to try and drive e-learning that's effective and to evolve with best practices. So our annual meeting, which is coming up in April, we have sessions designed to try and bring those who are involved in professional education together to learn best practices from each other. But there's no national standard that I know of to set principles for e-learning quality. I do think there's been a pretty broad and appropriate movement away from the deadly streaming PowerPoint or narrated PowerPoint stuff that doesn't hold people's attention for very long and isn't just reinforces the passive approach. And the other e-learning that I've seen used is just broadcasting someone else's auditorium at a different location. That can be pretty deadly because it has all the semblance of potentially sharing education and seems like a nice idea, but from an actual learning perspective doesn't seem to work very well. But participatory e-learning with pathways through materials, a set curriculum that's assigned to it, with set competency endpoints through sections of an e-learning program tend to work pretty well.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the key keeps coming back to active learning, doesn't it? In many ways, whatever the method. I'm just curious also, Graham, whether you feel or whether you see that the younger physicians coming up, are learning in different ways or more open to interactive techniques, small group learning, this type of thing.
Yes and no. I mean, it's interesting that my experience of more junior learners is that they are not tolerant of inefficiency.
Okay.
That's a really important observation, I think, because It comes back to these issues of efficiency as one of our new important metrics for the quality of an educational program for these extremely busy professionals. So they're also not particularly tolerant of general principles outside of things that are acutely relevant to their ability to care for patients. Okay. So if you have an ophthalmologist and you're trying to teach them about general principles of antibiotic strategies, you know, they're like looking at the ceiling saying, I don't really think I need to know this. I know I need to know something about antibiotics, but, you know, but unless you say, listen, here's how to handle the patient with X and Y and Z, you've lost them. So general principles, they're not very tolerant of. They're also much more tolerant of both small group exercises and active learning and bite-sized learning. So micro-learning experiences and activities, and technology-facilitated learning. Not surprisingly, they've spent, remember, more time on games than they have in school by the time they reach the age of 18 or 20 at this point in their development. So all of those things are relevant and important. A key principle to take home, though, is that cases are your friend. Cases are such a terrific way of learning because they can bring the junior and the more senior learners together. They can derive your own relevance from a case that's well constructed. And you don't even have to have answers when you present a case. You can just present cases and get groups of professionals to talk about it, and you find useful learnings from those experiences. So cases are the way forward for trying to engage junior learners rather than tactics.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pause because I can go on forever, but.
So my proposal, since the software doesn't allow us to run the questions again, it seems that once they are run, they just end the poll. So this is my incursion into the software. But as we have the emails address of all the participants, maybe we could send the questions again and then compare, because we have the answers here, and then compare and share with the participants. That would be the best as we can do.
I was mostly just curious as to whether it was going to...
Yes, and we can
see if there's any difference. Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions that Amy or Jane or Helena, you thought on that chat that you've seen you wanted me to touch base on, or that any of you wanted to respond to?
I haven't seen any others, Graham. I had one in the beginning, but you answered mine along the way, so I'm happy. Thank you.
I just wanted to reinforce your comment on cases being your friend. I'm seeing an increase in what's called problem-based learning discussions within large conferences. And you're right, it involves people at different levels of their stages of their careers. Very, it's small, it's to the point, it never lasts more than an hour. Everybody's engaged, and they're really gaining in popularity, which as an educator makes me happy.
Touching on your case-based learning, Jane, one of the programs we run in one of our specialities is looking at complications, and literally the entire program is open to complications. So we look at key tips and tricks and techniques to help get you out of complications, but we also put up stuff, our delegates put up stuff where some people don't have the answer, and it's amazing to see how that discussion comes up, and how they really, as Graham said, it links the older generation and the new generation, and facilitates that knowledge transfer. Everybody's taking out their little nugget of knowledge to take back.
Right, it's a bit like an unconference conference, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I would just like to add this kind of different way, that I would like to ask Graham if he has any experience or has noticed something that could be different in the ways of people liking to learn, connected with their own learning styles. I mean, because we are always focusing on case-based, on, interaction, but there are the theoretic people who like to learn, who like to listen to very good lectures, who learn by that. And sometimes I seem to see that all those kinds of formats of learning are kind of, just put aside completely, or at least sometimes they come just to the low part of the pile of the formats that we can have, and we are just focusing on the practical aspect of learning. Just you learn because you have to learn, because you have to learn this particular thing to apply. So this is just so kind of direct, so linear. So this is just a thought, just to think about.
Well, I think one of the key things I would take away from your question is that clinicians have a lot of choice now about how they learn. There's no shortage of materials for them to learn from their professional societies, from their national medical organization, from their colleagues, and from books and online databases, etc. They are learning from a variety of these sources. The key challenge is to displace them from this position of complacency or overconfidence. And sometimes if they are not pushed a little bit beyond that confidence, they'll spend all their time just reading about diabetes when they should know stuff about thyroid, or they should know stuff about infection control as well, or communications. So we have responsibilities for guiding our community to places where their learning preferences or their learning style preferences may need to be challenged, so that they have broader and different experiences, and help them function at the top of their capacity across the competencies. And that's part of our responsibility. That's some part of the future of CME, is being all things to all people.
And I think part of that, learning styles is an area I've spent a lot of time with. It's helping people design programs that do, because it's about using them all. We all need to use them all. And if you can design a program that brings out the strengths of the different styles, then yes, sometimes I'm going to feel stretched and challenged, and other times I'm going to feel comfortable.
Yeah.
But all in all, we have a more complete picture.
But a key part of that is using educational psychology, because most of us do one and done programs. We put on our update in heart failure, conference closes, we're done, right? And we feel very satisfied. But from a learning perspective, that may have been pointless. It may have been expensive and pointless. You really have to find mechanisms to re-engage your audience repeatedly over time, to consolidate that information, or the likelihood of you having actual real learning impact or performance impact is very low. And that is really hard. It's really hard. I know, I've tried so many times, but we got to do it, and we got to do it better for us to be effective. And then if we are effective, we have the credibility to be saying to people, pay us more for our work, or invest in education, not pay us, but invest in education so they can have these outcomes. But we got to be able to show the outcomes that we can have, and it's not going to come from one and done, particularly passive learning approaches.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we're on the dot of...
We are. Helena, are you going to wrap us up today?
Yes, well, that will be my honor to adjourn this first webinar of the series of webinars on CPD organized by the AME CPD committee. We have had the enormous pleasure to have as first speaker in opening this series Graham McMahon, also a member of the CPD committee. And we had this brave team from the CPD committee working on this: Jane Tipping, Amy Wolf, and myself as well, with the greatest audience of participants with us. So this is a great momentum. This was and is still a great momentum. And I embrace you all since Lisbon. My gratitude to all of you. Let's meet again in the next webinar of this series next first Monday of February, as all first Mondays of the months ahead, to explore several aspects that we have in our program on CPD amongst ourselves in this kind of learning, interesting, exciting environment that we have. So bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
I
Thank
Goodbye,
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
so much. Thank you, Graham. Thank you all. Thank you, Jane, Amy.
Yeah, thank you,
Bye-bye.
Helena.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.